She had learned not to cry in public, learned to keep her shoulders from shaking, learned to smile while the hand beneath the table crushed her fingers hard enough to leave bruises shaped like his rings. 3 years. That's how long Evelyn Hartwell had been disappearing. One dinner, one apology, one silent scream at a time. But tonight, in a restaurant full of people who would rather look away, one man refused to. And the moment their eyes met across the room, everything Grant Mercer had built around her began to crack. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where I need you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been coming down since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as press. Steady, suffocating, turning the city's Friday night energy into something gray and close. By the time the black sedan pulled up to Marcello's, the streets outside were mirror slick, and the restaurant windows had fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Candles burning low on white-clothed tables, soft piano threading through the noise of polite conversation, and expensive wine being poured into expensive glasses. Evelyn stepped out of the car before the valet could reach her door. She had learned not to wait. Waiting meant Grant had to open the door for her, and Grant opening the door for her meant Grant setting the terms for how grateful she was supposed to look about it. So she moved first, heels finding the wet pavement, one hand already smoothing the front of the black dress she'd spent 40 minutes choosing. Not because she wanted to look beautiful tonight, but because she knew the cost of choosing wrong. Grant came around from the driver's side, keys already handed off, hand already finding the small of her back. His fingers pressed just slightly too hard. "You look fine," he said. Not a compliment, a calibration. She said thank you anyway. Inside, Marcello's smelled like garlic and money. The maitre d' recognized Grant immediately. Of course he did. Grant made sure of that, tipping heavy in the early visits to guarantee the kind of greeting that made him feel like the room tilted toward him when he walked in. The man smiled, collected their coats, and led them toward a corner table near the window, the best seat in the house, the one Grant had requested specifically because it meant everyone in the restaurant could see them. That was the thing about Grant Mercer that took Evelyn nearly a year to understand. He didn't take her to nice places because he loved her. He took her to nice places because she was part of the display. The watch on his wrist, the car in the valet line, the woman who looked good in black and knew when to laugh and when to be quiet. She slid into her chair, smoothed her dress again, placed her hands in her lap where he could see them. "Stop fidgeting," Grant said, without looking up from the menu. "I'm not fidgeting. Your hands." She stilled them, felt the familiar tightening in her chest. That small interior collapse she'd gotten so practiced at hiding it had almost started to feel normal. Almost. She picked up her own menu and tried to read it, though she already knew what she'd order. The same thing she always ordered, because ordering something different meant Grant asking why she'd changed, and why she'd changed meant a conversation she didn't want to have at a table where everyone could see her face. The waiter came. Grant ordered for both of them without asking. Evelyn kept her eyes on the table. Across the room, she was not yet aware of the man watching them. The dinner began. The way dinners with Grant always began. Pleasantly enough on the surface, the kind of surface that other people saw and thought how lovely. What a handsome couple. Grant was charming in the early minutes, talking about a deal he was close to closing, a contract that would push his consultancy into a new tier of revenue. He used words like strategic leverage and significant upside, and Evelyn nodded at the right moments, asked the right questions, kept the performance going. She had become very good at the performance. It was around the time the main course arrived that something shifted. She'd made the mistake of glancing across the room. Not at anything in particular, just the restless, involuntary movement of a person who needed, for 1 second, to look somewhere else. Her eyes had drifted to another table where a couple sat laughing, the woman leaning forward, genuinely lit up, the man across from her looking at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. Something crossed Evelyn's face. She wasn't even fully aware of it. A flash of something. Longing, maybe, or grief, or just the recognition of the distance between what love was supposed to feel like and what she had. But Grant saw it. He always saw it. "Who are you looking at?" "No one. You were looking at someone." "Grant, I wasn't. I was just—" "Don't." His voice dropped, the way it did when they were in public and he needed to keep control without raising it. That particular register she'd come to dread more than shouting, because shouting she could brace for. This was surgical. Don't do that thing where you pretend I'm making something out of nothing. I'm not pretending anything. You were staring across the restaurant at another man. She hadn't been. She had been staring at the woman. But she understood, sitting there with her fork suspended above her plate, that the specific truth of it didn't matter. Grant had decided what she was doing, and that decision was now the reality they would both have to live inside for the rest of the night. I'm sorry, she said, and hated herself for saying it. Grant cut into his steak with slow, deliberate strokes. You look desperate when you do that. I wasn't doing anything. Evelyn. He set down his knife, looked at her directly, and there was something in his eyes she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the promise of it, held just behind the surface like a blade kept sheathed. I've told you before about the way you carry yourself in public. It reflects on me. Everything you do reflects on me. You understand that? She did. She had been told enough times. Yes, she said. Then act like it. She picked up her fork. Took a bite she couldn't taste. The woman across the room was still laughing. Evelyn focused on the tablecloth. It was during that stretch of silence, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but rather pressurized, the kind you sit inside and wait for the next thing to detonate, that she felt it. The awareness that someone was watching. Not the ambient social awareness of a crowded restaurant. Something more direct than that. More specific. She lifted her eyes almost without meaning to and found them, immediately and without searching, landing on a man seated alone at a table diagonal to theirs, perhaps 15 feet away. He was watching Grant, not her. Grant. With an expression that was absolutely still and absolutely cold, the kind of stillness that didn't come from disinterest but from the opposite of it, the kind of stillness that preceded something. She looked away quickly, but she'd seen enough to register the details, even in that brief moment. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. It was genuinely hard to tell. Dark hair, well-cut suit that didn't look like it was trying to be anything. A glass of something amber-colored sitting untouched in front of him. He was alone at a four-person table, which at Marcello's on a Friday night meant something. You didn't get a four-person table alone on a Friday night at a place like this without someone making sure you did. She did not look at him again, but she felt him there. Grant's phone buzzed. He checked it, frowned at whatever he saw, and pushed his chair back. I need to take this outside, he said, already standing, already adjusting his jacket. Don't do anything embarrassing while I'm gone. She watched him walk toward the front of the restaurant, phone already at his ear, and when the door swung shut behind him, she let out a breath she'd been holding for the better part of an hour. Her shoulders dropped, her hands unclenched from where they'd been pressed together in her lap. She stared at her water glass. That looked like it hurt. The voice came from her left. She turned, and the man from the diagonal table was now seated across from her, in Grant's chair, which he'd pulled out and settled into with a naturalness that suggested he was used to occupying space that other people thought of as theirs. Up close he was sharper than she'd registered from across the room. Not handsome in a soft way, but in a way that had something hard underneath it, like structure under fabric. His eyes were dark and very direct, and he was looking at her with the kind of attention that wasn't invasive but wasn't casual either. I'm sorry, she managed. Your hands, he said. You've been holding them like that since you sat down, like you're trying to keep them from doing something they want to do. She glanced at her hands, put them flat on the table. You've been watching us. I've been watching him, he said. The distinction was quiet but precise. She didn't know what to say to that. The ambient noise of the restaurant continued around them. Glasses, silverware, someone laughing too loud 3 tables over. And none of it touched the particular stillness that had settled around this conversation. My fiancé will be back in a moment, she said. I know. He didn't move. That's why I'm here now. She looked at him fully then, really looked, trying to read the situation. Was this someone Grant knew, a business rival, someone looking to cause a different kind of problem she'd have to manage later? But his expression held nothing she could categorize. It was patient. It was waiting. What do you want? She asked. Nothing from you. He leaned forward very slightly, both forearms resting on the table, voice low enough that it didn't carry. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about the answer before you give me the reflex one. She said nothing, which was, she realized, its own kind of answer. Do you want help? He said, or do you want to spend the rest of your life pretending this is love? The question landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a precision that made her breath catch, not because it was offensive, though it should have been, a stranger asking something like that, inserting himself into something that wasn't his business, but because of how exactly it landed, how precisely it named the thing she hadn't let herself name in 3 years of naming everything else instead. "You don't know anything about my life," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I know what I watched for the last 40 minutes. We're fine. Okay, She stopped, heard herself. The word fine sitting there between them, hollow as a bell with no clapper. "You should go back to your table." He didn't move immediately, just looked at her for a moment longer, like he was giving her room to change her mind. And when she didn't say anything else, he pushed his chair back and stood. "My name is Dante Valenti," he said, "in case you decide you want a different answer." He walked back to his table with the same unhurried ease he'd arrived with. Evelyn turned back to her water glass. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the table again, feeling the cool, smooth linen under her palms, trying to breathe through the strange vertigo that had come with that exchange. Dante Valenti. The name meant nothing to her, and yet Grant came back 4 minutes later. She knew because she'd been watching the door, watching for him with the hypervigilance she'd developed over years of needing to know when he was coming before he arrived. He slid into his chair, pocketed his phone, looked at her plate. "You barely touched your food." "I wasn't very hungry." "I told Marcus we'd have dinner with them next weekend," Grant said. "You need to be better than this. His wife is—" "Grant!" He stopped. The interruption surprised him. She could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the recalibration. She didn't interrupt. That was known between them, understood. She did not interrupt Grant. She wasn't sure why she'd done it. The word had come out of her throat like a reflex she hadn't approved, and now it was there, hanging in the space between them, and she felt the temperature at the table drop several degrees in the space of a second. "What did you just do?" he said, very quietly. What did you just do, Evelyn?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Look at me." She looked at him. His face was controlled, but she knew the geography of it well enough to read what was happening underneath. The grid of anger laying itself down, coordinate by coordinate. "We're going to go home tonight," he said, "and we're going to have a very clear conversation about the way you speak to me in public. Do you understand?" She understood. She understood the way she always understood. With her whole body, the anticipatory flinch of someone who had learned exactly what very clear conversations meant. "Yes," she whispered. "Good." He picked up his fork again, and for a moment it was as if the exchange had not happened, and Evelyn sat there in its aftermath, feeling the familiar weight settle back across her shoulders, heavier than usual because for a few minutes, just a few minutes, it had lifted. A stranger had looked at her, and she had almost felt like a person instead of an arrangement. She looked down at her plate, and then, because she could not stop herself, because something in her had been cracked open by 12 words from a man she didn't know, she looked across the room one more time. Dante Valenti was already watching her. He didn't look away when their eyes met, didn't pretend he hadn't been looking. He simply held her gaze with that same patient stillness, and in his expression was something she hadn't seen directed at her in so long it took her a moment to identify it. Concern, not pity, not curiosity. Concern, the kind that belongs to someone who is deciding whether to do something. She looked away first. Her pulse was loud in her ears. The next 40 minutes were the longest of her life. Grant moved through them the way he always moved through a dinner that had gone slightly wrong by his accounting, contained, precise, punishing in the most calibrated way, the way that left marks you couldn't photograph. The comments came evenly spaced. "Too much mascara, that dress is a little much for this place. Didn't you used to know how to hold a conversation? Not screaming, never screaming in public, just the steady drip of it, each sentence a degree colder than the last." Evelyn had long since finished her wine and was considering whether to ask for more when she made the mistake, or the act of courage, she would never be entirely sure which, of responding. Grant had said something about her sister, something dismissive and cutting about the way her family embarrassed him at the last gathering, and something in Evelyn's chest had simply had enough. "Stop," she said. It came out without volume, but with an edge she hadn't used in years, something underneath the word like a bone that had been waiting to surface. Grant stared at her. The table around them had gone slightly quieter. The couple nearest them had registered something. the way people in proximity to rising voltage register it before they can name it. "What did you just say to me?" Grant said. "I said stop." Her voice was steadier than her heartbeat. Her heartbeat was trying to leave her body. "Stop talking about my family. Stop talking about me like I'm something that needs managing. Stop." The silence that followed was the kind that felt structural, like the moment before weight-bearing walls decide what they're going to do. Grant leaned forward. "You are going to lower your voice," he said very softly. "And you are going to sit there and—" She said stop. The voice came from somewhere behind Grant's left shoulder, and it was not loud. If anything, it was quieter than Grant's had been, but it had something in its texture that made the two words sufficient, complete. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had never needed it. Grant turned. Dante Valenti was standing beside their table. He had not rushed over. He hadn't materialized dramatically or arrived with any theatrical energy. He was simply there, as if he'd always been going to be there, hands loose at his sides, regarding Grant with an expression of total and patient disinterest. Like a man studying an insect he's already decided what to do about. "Excuse me," Grant said. "This is a private conversation." "Not anymore," Dante said. Grant's jaw tightened. He was not a small man. Broad through the shoulders, gym-built, accustomed to physical presence being sufficient for most situations. He looked at Dante the way men like him looked at anyone who stepped into their space, assessing, dismissing, preparing to escalate. "I don't know who you are," Grant said, "but you need to walk away right now." "Grant Mercer," Dante said. Not a greeting. Just the name, stated plainly, the way you'd read an address from a piece of paper. 42 years old, you run a mid-market consultancy on the 9th floor of the Harlow building. Your company processed a little over $3.2 million in contracts last year, which is about 40% less than you tell people at dinners like this one. You have a lease, not a deed, on the apartment you call your penthouse, and you have a prior formal complaint filed against you at the Wilton Street precinct from a woman named Dana Carver, which was withdrawn 6 weeks after it was filed. He paused. "I didn't need to know any of that tonight, but I made a point of finding out anyway, because I wanted to understand exactly who I was looking at." The color had drained from Grant's face in stages during that recitation, and what replaced it was something uglier than the controlled anger Evelyn knew. It was the panicked rage of a man whose carefully constructed version of himself has just been read back to him in front of witnesses. "You're going to regret—" "No." Dante's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're going to stand up. You're going to leave this restaurant, and you're going to understand clearly that whatever you think you have over this woman ends tonight." "She's my fiancée." "She was." Dante glanced at Evelyn, just briefly, and in that glance was a question. The whole room had gone quiet. The piano had stopped. The waitstaff had organized themselves along the periphery the way professionals do when they sense a situation has moved past their jurisdiction. Every table near them had turned. Evelyn sat with her hands flat on the table, the candlelight unsteady, and felt the question hanging in the air between her and this man she didn't know. This stranger who had looked at her and decided she was worth the complication. 3 years. 3 years of very clear conversations. 3 years of fine and sorry and yes. She looked at Grant. She looked at the ring on her finger. She took it off. She set it on the tablecloth between them with a sound that was barely audible but felt to her like something very loud. "No," she said, one word. The word she'd swallowed back 10,000 times. It sat there in the air, free of her body for the first time in years, and she felt something happen to her spine. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quiet, structural shift of a person who has remembered they have one. Grant's expression collapsed through several things at once. Shock, disbelief, and then, underneath it, the particular ugliness of a man who has just had something taken from him. He reached for her arm. He didn't get there. 2 men, who had been seated at separate tables, who she now understood had not been seated separately at all, materialized on either side of Grant with a speed and coordination that made the whole thing look choreographed, and Grant found himself standing with his arm held and his balance compromised in the quiet, certain understanding that he was not going to win whatever came next. "You'll be hearing from—" "You can send anything you want to my attorneys," Dante said. He turned away from Grant then, dismissing him the way you close a door, and looked at Evelyn. "Are you all right?" She was shaking. She could feel it in her fingertips, the backs of her knees, somewhere behind her sternum. She was absolutely shaking, and she could not determine if it was fear or relief or the total disorientation of having just, in the span of 4 minutes, detonated 3 years of her life? I don't know, she said honestly. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, softer than that, and more complicated. That's a better answer than fine, he said. She looked at the ring sitting on the tablecloth. She did not pick it up. Behind her, she could hear Grant being escorted toward the front of the restaurant, his voice rising once and then cutting off, the sound of the door, and then silence where he had been. The restaurant slowly, carefully, resumed its ambient noise. Someone poured wine. The piano started again somewhere, tentative, like a question. Evelyn sat in the chair she had sat in for the last 2 hours and breathed, just breathed. The kind of breathing you do when something that has been pressing on your chest for years has, without warning, been lifted. You knew who he was, she said, before you came over. You already knew all of that. Yes. Why? Dante pulled out Grant's empty chair and sat down across from her again, unhurried, like there was nothing unusual about any of this. He picked up his glass from the table where a waiter had quietly retrieved it and placed it, and took a measured sip. Because I've been watching this table for 40 minutes, he said, and I know what I know about men who sit the way he sits. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him. He looked at her. The candle between them was burning low, throwing unsteady light across the tablecloth, across her hands, across the space where the ring still sat untouched. What happens now? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. There was a consideration in the pause, not hesitation, but something more deliberate than that, like a man choosing the accurate thing over the comfortable thing. That depends on you, he finally said. Tonight, nothing. You have somewhere safe to go? She thought of the apartment, Grant's apartment, the spare key he had, the alarm code she'd tried once to change and found herself somehow never getting around to, the very clear conversation he'd promised her. No, she said. Dante nodded slowly, like this was information he was filing. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a card on the table, plain cardstock, a number, no name. Call that, he said. Someone will answer. They'll arrange whatever you need for tonight. She stared at the card. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know enough. That's a concerning thing for a stranger to say. The corner of his mouth moved, something almost dry about it, almost like he found the pushback appropriate rather than offensive. You're not wrong, he said. Be careful who you trust. He stood, starting with him. He glanced toward the door where Grant had been removed, and the glance was utterly without drama, utterly final. He's going to call you tonight. He's going to cycle through everything, the apology, the threat, the apology again. Don't be where he expects you to be when he does. Evelyn looked at the card. She looked at the empty chair where Grant had sat. She looked at the ring she had taken off and left on the tablecloth like shedding something dead. She was 31 years old, and she had just burned down the last 3 years of her life in a restaurant in front of strangers, and her hands would not stop shaking. She had nowhere to sleep tonight. She had a wardrobe, a car, and whatever was in her bag, all of it inside or adjacent to a life that belonged to a man who had just been walked out of a restaurant, and who was, right now, somewhere outside in the rain, working himself toward a fury she knew intimately. She picked up the card. She turned it over once in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the strange gravity of a small, flat piece of cardstock that might be the most dangerous thing she'd held in years, or the most necessary. Dante had already moved back toward his own table. He hadn't looked back, hadn't waited to see what she decided. The men who had flanked Grant were gone, blended back into the restaurant or the night outside. She couldn't be sure. It was as if the whole intervention had been a weather event, sudden, total, and then simply over. She sat alone at the table for another 2 minutes. Then she put the card in her bag. She put her hand on the table and pushed herself to standing, and her legs held, which surprised her slightly. She left the ring where it was. She did not look at it again. She walked to the front of the restaurant, collected her coat, and stepped out into the rain. The city was wet and loud and indifferent in the way cities are, and she stood on the sidewalk in the downpour with her coat held closed and her phone already buzzing in her bag. Grant, the screen said. Grant, Grant, Grant. And she thought about the woman across the room who had been laughing. The woman who had leaned forward because she wanted to, not because she'd calculated the cost of leaning away. She pressed decline. She pressed it again. She took out Dante Valenti's card. Standing in the rain with traffic sliding past and the restaurant light gold and warm, behind the glass she was no longer inside of, and she found that her hands had stopped shaking. She dialed the number. It rang twice. A man answered. Calm, professional, no name. Ms. Hartwell, he said, as if he'd been expecting her, as if her name on his lips was a fact that had already been arranged, which meant Dante had known she would call, or had made sure the conditions existed for her to. She stood in the rain and understood, for the first time, that she had just entered the orbit of something she did not yet have a full map of. That the man who had just dismantled 3 years of her captivity in 4 minutes at a white tablecloth restaurant was not a simple man with simple motives. That Dante Valenti's kindness, if that was what this was, came from somewhere complicated. And that she had just said yes to finding out where. I need somewhere to stay tonight, she told the man on the phone. Yes, ma'am, he said. We have that arranged. The car arrived in less than 3 minutes. The car was a black sedan, not the same one that had brought her to Marcello's. That one had been Grant's, a lease he called ownership the same way he called control of. This one was quieter inside, the leather cold against the backs of her thighs. The partition between her and the driver, a dark pane of glass that asked nothing of her. She sat with her bag in her lap, and her coat still damp from the rain, and watched the city slide past the window and tried to locate, somewhere inside herself, an emotion she could name with any precision. She couldn't. What she found instead was a kind of buzzing blankness, the interior equivalent of static. Not peace, nothing as clean as that, but the temporary suspension of feeling that the body sometimes grants you after impact, before the pain has figured out where to go. Her phone had stopped buzzing. That was worse somehow. Grant going quiet was never Grant giving up. It was Grant recalibrating, choosing his angle. She'd learned early that the silences were the part she needed to be afraid of, not the noise. The car stopped in front of a building she didn't recognize, mid-rise, clean lines, the kind of discreet architecture that communicated money without advertising it. A woman was waiting under the awning. Late 40s, dark coat, the composed and unhurried bearing of someone who solved problems professionally. She opened Evelyn's door before the driver could. Ms. Hartwell, she said, same tone as the man on the phone, prepared. I'm Clara. I'll get you settled. Who are you? Evelyn asked. She was still sitting in the car. I work for Mr. Valenti. Doing what? Clara's expression didn't shift. Tonight, getting you somewhere dry and safe, that's all. Evelyn looked at the building. She looked at the rain. She thought about the alternative, Grant's apartment, the key he had, the very clear conversation waiting for her there like a trap that had already been set. She got out of the car. The apartment was on the 14th floor. It was not a hotel room. It was fully furnished in a way that felt lived in without being personal, the kind of space maintained for occupancy without suggesting permanent attachment to any particular life. Clean sheets, food in the refrigerator, a bathroom with products still in their packaging. A guest space, but a careful one. Clara left her with a phone number, different from the one on the card, and told her to call if she needed anything, said it the way people said it when they meant it, without the upward inflection that made the offer feel performative. Evelyn stood in the kitchen after she left and drank a glass of water and looked at her own hands on the counter. The ring was gone. Her hands looked strange without it. Not lighter. She'd expected lighter. They just looked like different hands. Hands that belonged to a version of herself she hadn't been introduced to yet. She went to bed at midnight and lay there in the dark with the rain still working against the windows and did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed about nothing, which was the best thing she could have asked for. She woke to sunlight coming in at an angle she didn't recognize because the windows faced east and she'd been waking up to west-facing light for 3 years. The disorientation lasted about 4 seconds, and then the previous night returned in full, and she lay there and let it. The restaurant. The ring on the tablecloth. The man who had said her name before she'd told it to him. Her phone had 43 missed calls from Grant. 7 voicemails. She didn't listen to any of them, but she read the texts. Not out of sentiment, but because she'd learned you needed to know what Grant was thinking if you were going to stay ahead of it. The first few were what she'd expected, calm in a way that was clearly performed, the texts of a man who had gone home and made himself a drink and decided to wait her out. Then they escalated. Not threats exactly. Grant was too careful for explicit threats. But the architecture of them, the frame without the photograph. Things like, you're going to realize what you've done, and there are things I could say about you, and I think we both know this isn't over. She put the phone face down on the nightstand and got up. She showered. changed into the clothes Clara had apparently arranged, a bag she hadn't noticed the night before, sitting inside the closet door, containing exactly her size of exactly the kind of thing she might have chosen for herself, which was unsettling in its precision, but practical enough that she set the unsettling aside for later. She made coffee in the kitchen and stood at the window watching the city move below her, 14 stories down. All that ordinary forward motion of a Saturday morning that had no idea what had happened to her the night before. She was still there, second cup in hand, when the intercom buzzed. Ms. Hartwell, the doorman. There's a Mr. Valenti here. She set down her cup. Send him up, she said, and then immediately questioned the reflex of it. No consideration, no hesitation, just send him up, as if she'd already decided to trust a man she'd met for a combined total of perhaps 12 minutes the night before. She stood at the kitchen counter and waited and tried to figure out what she was feeling. Nervous. Yes, but not the way she was nervous around Grant. That was a whole-body vigilance, every sense organized around detecting threat. This was different. This was the nervousness of uncertainty rather than danger, which was not the same thing at all, and she was still parsing the distinction when the knock came. She opened the door. Dante Valenti in daylight was slightly different from the restaurant version. Same bearing, same quality of self-containment, but without the candlelight and the theater of what had happened there. He was just a man standing in a hallway in a dark jacket with a coffee cup in each hand, and the coffee cup detail struck her as unexpected enough that she almost said something about it. I brought coffee, he said, in case the stuff in the kitchen wasn't. I already made some. Okay. He held up one of the cups anyway. She stepped back from the door. He came in and set one cup on the counter and kept the other and looked around the apartment with the eyes of someone checking that a thing has been done correctly, not admiringly. Then he looked at her. How'd you sleep? Badly, she said. Why are you here? To see how you are. You sent someone to do that last night. Clara makes sure practical things are handled, he said. That's different. She crossed her arms, studied him. In the daylight, in this quiet, she was aware of details she hadn't registered in the velocity of the night before. The slight scar along his jaw, barely visible, the kind that came from something specific rather than something accidental. The way he stood with his weight slightly back, the posture of someone accustomed to reading a room before committing to it. You knew my name before you came to the table, she said. You knew his full financial profile. You had men in that restaurant position before anything happened. You had this apartment ready. She paused. That's not someone who made a spontaneous decision to help a stranger. He didn't flinch at any of it, just listened, like each item on the list was something he'd expected her to reach. No, he said, it's not. So tell me what it is. He set down his coffee cup, pulled out one of the bar stools at the kitchen counter and sat down without asking if that was all right. Not in a presumptuous way, but in the way of someone who had decided to be present and was doing that rather than performing it. Grant Mercer has a business partner, he said. Had. Man named Reeves. They had a falling out 18 months ago over a contract Mercer cut him out of. Reeves came to me with information about Mercer's business practices. Some of it interesting, most of it the kind of petty professional grievance I don't have use for. He paused. What caught my attention was a mention of you. Not by name, just the woman Mercer keeps. That was how Reeves described it. The woman he keeps. Something moved through her at that, old and familiar and deeply unpleasant. Reeves mentioned a prior complaint, Dante continued, a woman who'd filed and then withdrawn. I had someone look into it, Dana Carver. She'd been with Mercer for about a year before you. She withdrew the complaint after 2 weeks, left the city within a month. He looked at Evelyn directly. That pattern isn't unique to him, but it's useful to recognize. So you were investigating Grant, loosely. He's peripheral to some business interests I have. Nothing major. But I knew who he was before I walked into that restaurant last night. And then you saw us. And then I saw you. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down again. And I made a choice. She was quiet for a moment, working through the geometry of it. The calculated nature of his intervention sat uncomfortably against the effect it had produced. She couldn't decide if knowing it was premeditated made it more or less trustworthy. Spontaneous kindness was simple. Deliberate kindness was something else. You could have just called the police, she said. He wasn't breaking any laws in that restaurant. You know what I mean? I do, he said. And I'm going to be honest with you. Involving law enforcement at that stage would have created paperwork and not much else. You know that. You've lived with him for 3 years. You know exactly what his exposure actually looks like from the outside. She did know. She'd thought about it more than once. The calls she could make, the reports she could file, and every time she ran the calculation, she arrived at the same answer, which was that the formal systems available to her would create documentation and aggravate him without changing the fundamental situation. Without her willing testimony built on specifics she'd spent years minimizing, there wasn't enough. So you did it the other way, she said. I did what I know how to do. She looked at him. What do you know how to do exactly? The question was direct, and she meant it to be, because that was the thing sitting in the room with them. The thing she hadn't let herself examine too closely yet, but couldn't ignore. That a man who could have a restaurant infiltrated, who knew financial profiles, who had 2 men on standby at separate tables, who had an apartment ready and a staff accustomed to exactly this kind of arrangement, that man was not a civilian. Dante looked at her for a moment before answering. More than most people, he said, and things that would make some people uncomfortable. That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one. He leaned forward slightly on the bar stool, forearms on the counter. I have business interests that operate in legitimate markets. Real estate, development, some private equity. All of it auditable, all of it clean on paper. And I have history, family history, that comes from somewhere less clean. The Valenti name means specific things to specific people in this city. He paused. I'm not going to dress it up for you. She held his gaze. Her pulse was even, which surprised her. Are you telling me you're... I'm telling you that I operate in parts of this city where regular rules have limited reach, he said. And that the people who know me know not to confuse that with chaos. I'm not a chaos operation. Something quiet and certain in his voice. I have a code. It's mine. And one of its items is that I don't watch a man dismantle a woman in public and pretend I didn't see it. The apartment held the silence for a moment. Outside, the city continued its Saturday business, indifferent and loud. You could be dangerous to me, Evelyn said. Not a challenge, an honest assessment, offered flat. Yes, he said. I could. You're not going to tell me I'm wrong about that. No, he said. I'm going to tell you that I think you've had enough people in your life who told you your read of a situation was wrong when it was right. I'm not going to do that. Something in her chest shifted at that, barely perceptible. But there. She uncrossed her arms. I need my things, she said. From the apartment. My car is in his building's garage. There are documents. My own documents. My passport. Things I need. Dante nodded. Write down what you need. We'll have it by this afternoon. It's not that simple. Write down what you need, he said again. Not dismissive, certain. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up a pen from the counter and found a notepad in the kitchen drawer and started writing. The list was longer than she expected. That was the thing about leaving a life. Even one you hadn't wanted, even one that had been slowly destroying you. The inventory of it was surprisingly large. Clothes, yes, but also the photographs in the desk drawer, the journal she'd kept under a board in the closet floor, the external hard drive with everything she'd backed up, her grandmother's ring, which was different from his ring and which she would not leave behind. The small material evidence that she had existed as a person, separate from what he had made of her. She handed Dante the list. He read it without expression, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. The journal, he said, under a board. Third from the window in the bedroom closet, the nails loose. He nodded. She watched him and thought about the intimacy of having said that out loud. Having told this man the location of the thing she'd hidden from another man, the thing that contained 3 years of the truest version of what her life had actually been. The trust embedded in those 2 sentences. She wasn't sure when she'd decided to extend it. Maybe she hadn't decided. Maybe it had just happened, the way the other decisions of the past 12 hours seemed to have. Not deliberate exactly, but irresistible, like water finding its level. Her things arrived at 3 in the afternoon. 2 men she'd never seen brought boxes, set them neatly in the apartment's second bedroom, and left without being asked anything. The journal was on top of the first box. She checked the hidden seam on the back cover where she'd taped a folded piece of paper. Still there. Untouched. Dante was not with them. He'd left after the list. She spent the afternoon going through the boxes, taking stock, reassembling the material inventory of herself. Around 5, Clara arrived with food and the information that Grant had been to his own building's garage and discovered the car was gone and had filed a report claiming it was stolen. Clara delivered this with the tone of a person reading a weather update. "He can't do that," Evelyn said. "It's my car. It's in my name." "Yes," Clara said. "The report will go nowhere. But you should know he's making moves." She should have expected it. She did expect it. That was different from it not landing. She sat at the kitchen table after Clara left and thought about Grant. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular weariness of knowing someone's moves before they make them. He was going to file the car report. He was going to call her parents. He was going to appear at her workplace on Monday morning with flowers and a story that put the fracture firmly in her column. He was systematic. She knew his system. What she did not know was whether the system she had now entered, Dante's, whatever it was durable enough to hold against it. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. Not Grant's number, not Clara. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Miss Hartwell." A man's voice she didn't know. Older. Measured. "My name is Raymond Voss. I'm an attorney. I represent several of Mr. Mercer's business interests, and I'm calling to—" "How did you get this number?" she said. A pause. "Mr. Mercer provided it." "This isn't the number he has for me." Another pause. Longer. "I understand you've recently made some decisions that—" She hung up. She stared at the phone. This number, the one Clara had given her this morning, the one connected to whatever infrastructure Dante Valenti maintained, Grant's attorney had it. Which meant Grant had it. Which meant somewhere in the chain of last night and this morning, there was a line of information she hadn't accounted for. She called the number Clara had given her. Clara answered on the second ring. "Mercer's attorney just called me on this number," Evelyn said. "How?" Silence. Brief and controlled. "I'll look into it." "That's not what I need from you right now. I need to know if this apartment is secure." "Ms. Hartwell." "Clara." Her voice was level and hard. "Is this apartment secure?" "I'll have someone there within—" "Is it secure?" "I don't know," Clara said. And to her credit, she said it clean, without softening it. "I don't know yet. Stay where you are. Don't use that number again." Evelyn put the phone down on the table. She stood up, walked to the window, looked at the city that had no idea what was happening 14 floors up. She thought about the journal in the box in the other room. 3 years of the real version. 3 years of dates and incidents and the specific granular record of a life that looked normal from the outside and was something else entirely from within. She'd kept it because she'd always understood, somewhere underneath the daily work of survival, that documentation was the only form of power available to someone in her position. She had kept it the way people keep things they aren't sure they'll ever use but are terrified to be without. She thought about Dana Carver, who had filed a complaint and withdrawn it and left the city within a month. She thought about Dante, who had said, "I have a code," and said it like it was enough, and maybe believed it was. She picked up her phone and called the second number Clara had given her, the one for emergencies, the one she'd been told to use only if something was actually wrong. It rang once. Dante answered. "Grant's attorney has this number," she said, "the one Clara gave me this morning." No pause. No surprise in his voice, which meant the absence of surprise was a choice. "How long ago?" 20 minutes. "Are you alone in the apartment?" "Yes." "Don't leave, don't open the door. I'll be there in 15 minutes. She heard something in the background as he said it. The specific quality of ambient noise that preceded movement. The organized sounds of a man who had already started toward the door before he finished the sentence. She stood at the window and waited. 12 minutes, not 15. He knocked twice and then a third time, which she understood was a code because she opened it and found him standing there with the contained, directed energy of a man who had been calm in the car over and made no promises to stay that way. He came in and swept the apartment in under 2 minutes. Every room, every window, moving with a focus that was neither theatrical nor casual, just efficient in a way that suggested he had done exactly this before, many times, in different apartments. He came back to the kitchen. "There's nothing here," he said, "but the number is blown, which means someone talked." He looked at her. "Did you call anyone on it? Anyone besides Clara?" "No one." His jaw was tight. He was thinking, she could see it. Not the kind of visible thinking that people displayed, but the interior kind, the kind where the face goes very still because all the activity is elsewhere. "There's someone in my organization," he said. Not to her specifically. The words were landing in the room like something being put down heavily. She watched him. "You have a leak," she said. Yes. And that leak told Grant Mercer where I am. He looked at her directly. Not yet. They gave him a number, not a location, but a number is a step. He paused. I need to move you tonight. To where? Somewhere I haven't told anyone about yet. Something shifted in his expression, not quite vulnerability, but adjacent to it, the particular expression of a man who is about to say something he doesn't say often. There's a house I have outside the city. No one in my organization has the address on record. I had it purchased through 3 different entities specifically, so there was no straight line to my name. She understood what he was telling her. Not just that the house was safe, that he was offering her the safest thing he had, the thing he'd built to be beyond reach. Why does a man like you need a house no one knows about? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because a man like me has enemies, he said. And because sometimes I need to know there's one place where none of that follows me. She looked at him in the kitchen light of an apartment that had just become compromised, with her boxes in the other room and her journal and the accumulated physical evidence of everything she was trying to keep from a man who had not yet accepted that she had left. She thought about the distance between safe and free, about how she'd spent 3 years inside something that told her they were the same thing. If I go with you tonight, she said, I need to know I can leave whenever I want. Yes. Not, I'll take you wherever you want to go. I need my car. I need to be able to walk out. Your car is in the building garage, he said. It'll follow us out. She looked at him. Okay, she said. She turned to start collecting what she needed from the boxes, and she was reaching for the journal when her phone buzzed on the counter. Not a call. A text. From a number she didn't recognize, different from the attorney's. She picked it up. The message was 4 words. I know where you are. She stood very still. Dante had come to stand beside her, and she turned the phone so he could see the screen, and she watched his face as he read it, watched the stillness that came over him, the specific and absolute stillness that preceded something she hadn't seen from him yet, something she understood was there, underneath the patience and the measured voice and the coffee cups, waiting. That's not Mercer, he said. His voice had changed, still quiet, but the quality of the quiet was different. The difference between a closed door and a locked one. How do you know? Because that's not his style. He set the phone down on the counter, looked at it. That's someone who wants me to know they can reach you. Who would? Someone who has a problem with me. He looked at her, and in his eyes was the thing she'd wondered about since last night, the thing behind the patience, the thing that made 2 men appear at separate tables, and a file on Grant Mercer, and a house that no one had the address for. Someone who just found out I brought you into this. The apartment felt smaller suddenly. What does that mean? She said. For me. What does that mean? He didn't look away, didn't soften it. It means, he said, that leaving Mercer was the easier part. They left the apartment with what she could carry in one bag. Everything else, the boxes, the clothes Clara had arranged, the careful inventory of a life she was still trying to reconstruct, stayed behind. Dante made 1 call in the elevator, 2 words, and by the time they reached the garage level, her car was running and a second vehicle was already positioned at the exit with its lights off. She drove. That had been his instruction, and she hadn't questioned it. She understood the logic without needing it explained, that her car in her hands meant one thing she controlled in a night that was rapidly becoming a list of things she didn't. Dante rode in the passenger seat with his phone in his lap and his eyes on the side mirror and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes. The city thinned around them as they moved north, the dense compression of downtown giving way to wider streets, then to the kind of neighborhoods that existed in the margins between urban and not, gas stations and chain restaurants and dark stretches of road where the streetlights were spaced far enough apart that the darkness between them felt substantial. Take the next left, Dante said. She took it. Then stay on this road for about 8 miles. She stayed on it. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was functional. The silence of 2 people managing the same problem from adjacent positions, conserving energy for what came next. She was aware of him in the peripheral way you became aware of someone when the situation had stripped the social padding off everything and you were just 2 bodies in a car moving through the dark. The text, she said. You said it wasn't Mercer's style. Mercer threatens with implication, Dante said, eyes still on the mirror. Lawyers. Financial pressure. Social consequences. He's a man who uses systems because he trusts systems. A pause. That text was direct. Personal. Someone who wanted me to know they knew, not someone trying to scare you. Then who? He didn't answer immediately. The second vehicle behind them, she could see its lights in the rear view, maintaining a consistent distance, was both reassuring and not. There's a man named Caruso, Dante finally said. Felix Caruso. He runs distribution operations on the east side of the city. We've had an arrangement for about 6 years. Territorial, mostly. The kind of agreement that functions as long as both sides find it more useful than the alternative. And he's stopped finding it useful. He's been testing edges for the past 3 months. Small things. Shipments that crossed lines they shouldn't have. A contact approach that was clearly mine. Nothing I couldn't ignore without looking weak, but nothing I could move on without looking like I was breaking the arrangement first. He paused. He's been looking for a pressure point. She understood what he was saying. And I'm a pressure point. You became visible last night, a restaurant full of people, a scene that will have moved through certain conversations by this morning. People in my world pay attention to changes in behavior. I don't make scenes. I don't intervene in domestic situations in public restaurants. His voice was even, but underneath it she could hear something she hadn't detected before. Not regret exactly, but the specific weight of a man calculating what his choices have cost. Walking over to your table was the right thing to do. It was also a signal I didn't intend to send, that you care about something, that there's something to reach. She gripped the steering wheel, felt the road under the tires, the vibration of it, the reality of movement. You're telling me that helping me made you vulnerable. I'm telling you the truth, he said, which is what I said I'd do. She didn't know what to do with that. Filed it somewhere she'd examine later, when later existed. The house appeared after the 8th mile and then some, a turn onto an unpaved road she would have missed without direction, then through a tree line, and then a structure emerging from the dark that was larger than she'd imagined when he'd said, house. Not a compound, nothing that dramatic, but substantial. 2 stories, stone and dark wood, set back from everything with the particular solitude of a place that had been chosen for its distance from other things. No lights on inside. She parked. The second vehicle stopped at the tree line and stayed there. Dante came around to her side of the car before she'd fully processed that they'd arrived. Not to open her door, she was already opening it, but to stand in the way that she'd started to recognize as his particular default, slightly angled, reading the surrounding dark with the same focused passivity he applied to everything. Inside, the house smelled like wood and cold air and something faintly mineral, the smell of a place that had been closed for a while. Dante moved through it with the ease of genuine familiarity, turning on lamps rather than overheads, the light coming up warm and low. She stood in the entryway and watched him and thought, he's been here alone. Many times. You could tell. The way he moved through the space had no performance in it, no hosting instinct, just a man in a place he knew. She set her bag down. There's a room at the top of the stairs, he said. First on the left. It's the one I'd put you in. Where will you be? Down here. He looked at her. You're safe here. I need you to believe that's true. I'm working on it, she said. And she was. She went upstairs. The room was small and clean, with one window that looked out over the dark tree line, and she sat on the edge of the bed and held her phone and looked at the 4 words on her screen again. I know where you are. She didn't know, sitting in this house that wasn't on any record she knew of, whether that message was already outdated or whether it was still true. Both possibilities sat equally in her chest. She put the phone face down. She did not sleep well. But she slept. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of autumn morning that committed to neither one thing nor another. She came downstairs to find Dante at a wooden table near the kitchen window with a laptop open and 2 phones beside him, and the atmosphere of the room told her he had not slept at all. She said nothing about it, made coffee because the materials were there and it was something she could do, and set a cup beside his elbow, and he glanced at it and then at her with an expression that was brief and unreadable and returned to his screen. Tell me what you found, she said. He looked at her. He'd known she would ask. She could see it in the absence of surprise. The number Clara gave you, he said. It went through my operations coordinator, a man named Soto. He's been with me for 4 years. She sat down across from him. Was. Something moved in his jaw. He's gone. Cleared out his apartment last night, which means he made the decision before I knew there was something to decide, which means he knew you'd find out. He knew and he left anyway, which means whatever Caruso offered him was worth burning 4 years of trust for. He closed the laptop, set both hands flat on the table. Soto knew about this house? He's been here twice. The air in the room changed. She set down her coffee cup. You said no one knew the address. No one in my organization had it on record, he said. But Soto has been here physically. If he gave Caruso a description and a direction, he stopped. It takes more than that to find a specific property, but it's not nothing. She looked at the window, the tree line, the gray morning light coming through it. How long do we have? She said. I don't know. And she could hear, in those 3 words, the particular discomfort of a man who was accustomed to knowing things and had arrived at the edge of what he knew. My security outside will give us warning, but I need to move you again before I'm certain we need to, not after. Where? I'm working on that. Dante. Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she didn't soften it. I left an apartment last night because it was compromised. I'm sitting in a house this morning that might be compromised. I have a bag with 2 days of clothes and a journal and no plan. I need more than I'm working on it. He looked at her, and there was something in the look, not resentment at being pressed, which was what she'd have gotten from Grant, but something more uncomfortable than that, the expression of a man being accurately assessed. You're right, he said. Sit with me and I'll walk you through what I have. What he had was an outline, not a plan. Safe houses he trusted more than this one, contacts in other cities. Legal resources, an attorney, separate from his business interests, someone who handled what he described as sensitive personal matters without elaborating on what that meant. He laid it out methodically, and she listened and asked questions, and he answered them without editorializing, and it was the most functional conversation she'd had in years, in the sense that it was 2 people treating each other like they were both in possession of a brain. It was midway through this that her own phone rang. Not a number she recognized. She answered it on the second ring because she'd learned that unknown numbers were no longer things she could ignore. Evelyn, a woman's voice, familiar in a way that took her a disoriented second to place, and then it landed, her older sister, Nora, calling from a number Evelyn didn't have on file. I need you to listen to me and not hang up. Nora, why are you calling from? Because Grant Mercer came to my house this morning. Her sister's voice was controlled, but only barely, the specific control of someone holding something down with effort. He came to my house, Evelyn, with a man he introduced as his attorney, and he told me that you'd been taken. That's what he said. That someone had taken you, and that he was concerned for your safety, and that if I knew where you were, I needed to tell him. Evelyn was very still. Dante had looked up from his phones. He said taken, she said. He had photographs. Nora's voice cracked slightly and then re-hardened. Evelyn, he had photographs of you getting into a car outside the restaurant Friday night. And he had a photograph of you outside a building he said was connected to organized crime. And he made it sound a breath. He made it sound like you were being held against your will. The room was completely silent except for the gray morning outside. I'm not, Evelyn said. Nora, I am not being held against my will. Then come home. Come to me. Whatever is happening. I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to hear me. I left Grant. I left him voluntarily. I am safe, and I am not being held by anyone. She pressed her free hand flat against the table. Do not tell him anything. Do not tell him you talked to me. Do not let him back into your house. He said he's filing a missing persons. He can't. I'm an adult, and I left voluntarily, and there's nothing. She stopped, breathed. He's using you to find me. He's using you because he knows I'll respond to you. That's what this is. A long silence on the other end. Evelyn, Nora said quietly. Who is the man in the photographs? Evelyn looked at Dante across the table. Someone who helped me, she said. That's all I can tell you right now. That's not enough. I know. I'm sorry. And she meant it. The apology landing in a real place, not the reflexive sorry she'd spent years deploying. I'll call you when I can explain more. Please don't talk to Grant. She ended the call. The silence that followed had texture to it, the specific texture of a situation that had just grown a new dimension. He went to your sister, Dante said, with photographs, of me getting into the car, and of... She looked at him. He has photographs of me outside a building he's connecting to you. He's building a narrative, not threatening me, building a story where I'm the victim of something other than him. Dante's expression was tight. If he files a missing persons report, he won't. He can't make it stick. But she heard the uncertainty in her own voice, and she could tell from his face that he heard it too. He's not going to the police about something that would invite scrutiny of him. He's using it as social leverage. To get to my family. Maybe, Dante said, or he's doing both. Using your family to locate you and simultaneously creating a paper trail that frames whatever he does next as protective. She thought about that, about the architecture of it, which was, she had to admit, exactly Grant's architecture. Not impulsive, layered, the way he'd always operated, public face first, foundation underneath. He has someone watching your organization, she said. Soto reported to Caruso. But Grant has photographs of me with your infrastructure. That's a separate line. Dante was quiet. Dante. She leaned forward. Is it possible that Caruso and Grant Mercer are talking to each other? She watched his face work through it. Not the visible deliberation of someone who hadn't considered it, but the specific expression of someone who had just had a thing they'd been avoiding confirmed. It's possible, he said. How possible? Caruso has been expanding his operations into legitimate business fronts for 2 years. He needs consultants, financial structure, the kind of professional network that makes money look clean. He paused. Grant Mercer sells financial consulting services to people who need their structures to look clean. The two of them sat with that for a moment. They know each other, she said. They may be in business together. Which means when you walked over to my table Friday night, I didn't just pull a woman away from an abusive man. His voice was even, but the evenness was work now. She could hear it. I pulled a woman away from a man who may be financially connected to someone who has been looking for a way to move against me. And Caruso knew within hours, because Soto told him, and suddenly what looked like an impulsive act of... He stopped. Of decency, she said. Of decency, he said, looks instead like a strategic move. Like I knew the connection and made a play. Did you know? The question sat between them like something sharp. No, he said. I did not know. I saw a man hurting a woman in a restaurant, and I made a decision that had nothing to do with Felix Caruso. He looked at her directly. I need you to believe that. She looked at him for a long time. I believe you, she said. And she did, which was its own kind of complicated because believing him meant the situation was worse, not better. It meant they had both stumbled into the intersection of two separate problems and were now standing in the middle of something neither of them had designed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nora's borrowed number. He's still here. He won't leave. He's asking about a man named Valenti. Her stomach dropped. She turned the phone so Dante could see. He read it, looked up. And in his eyes was the thing she'd been watching for since Friday night. The full emergence of whatever lived behind the patience and the measured voice. The thing that had kept two men at separate tables and built a house with no address. It was not rage exactly. It was colder than that and more precise, the expression of a man who has just had his last available tolerance exceeded. He stood up. We need to go, he said. Now. Where? My estate. He was already moving, already reaching for the phones on the table. It's the one place I can actually defend. I'm done moving you between... He stopped. Because outside, through the kitchen window, beyond the tree line, headlights had appeared. Not one set. 3. Not his people. His people were one vehicle, lights off. These were moving. Coming up the unpaved road with the particular lack of hesitation of vehicles that knew where they were going. Dante crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and was at the window, standing to the side of the frame the way people stood when they didn't want to be seen from outside. Evelyn stood up slowly from the table. How? She said quietly, to the room, to herself. How do they have this address? Dante turned from the window, and in his face she saw something she hadn't seen there before. Not fear. It wasn't fear, but it was the thing adjacent to it, the thing that lives one step back from fear and sometimes gets mistaken for it. The moment when a man who has always had a next move realizes the board has been rearranged around him while he was looking somewhere else. Soto didn't just give Caruso a description, he said. He gave him everything. From outside, she heard a car door, then another, then silence, which was somehow louder than either. Dante looked at her, and in the look was something she understood without translation. There were no more safe houses, no more contingency positions, no more arranged cars and organized exits and infrastructure built around control. There was this house, these walls, the tree line, and the gray morning, and whatever was coming up that road. And there was the choice he'd made on Friday night in a restaurant, which had seemed simple from the outside, and turned out to have roots that went down into ground neither of them had fully mapped. "Stay behind me," he said. She looked at the window. The headlights were still moving, closer now, and the sound of tires on unpaved road had become audible through the walls. She thought about Dana Carver, who had withdrawn her complaint and left the city. She thought about the journal in her bag upstairs. She thought about the woman in the restaurant who had been laughing. And then she stopped thinking about all of it, because there was no room for retrospection in what was coming through that tree line. And she crossed the kitchen and stood beside Dante at the edge of the window and looked out at the approaching lights, and felt something settle in her chest that was not calm exactly, but was its nearest available neighbor. The particular steadiness of a person who has run out of the option of looking away and has decided, somewhere below the level of conscious choice, that they are done. The headlights stopped moving. 3 vehicles strung along the unpaved road like a sentence that hadn't finished yet, and for about 4 seconds, nothing happened. No doors, no voices, just the engine heat cooling in the gray morning air and the specific quality of silence that precedes organized movement. Dante was already on his phone, 2 words, then 3. Then he put it in his jacket and turned from the window. "Back of the house," he said. "There's a door through the utility room. It opens to a path that runs along the east side of the tree line. My man outside knows it." "How many people are out there?" "Enough that going through them isn't the first option." He moved toward the hallway, and she moved with him, bag already in her hand from the table where she'd had it since she came downstairs. And that small preparedness, the unconscious readiness of a woman who had spent years knowing she might need to move, served her now in a way she'd never anticipated. The utility room was cold, concrete floor, the door at its far end a heavy thing with a bar lock. Dante lifted the bar and pushed it open to the morning air, and immediately the sound of the surrounding trees was present. Wind in branches, birds disturbed, the alive acoustic of outdoor space after the compression of the house. The man from the perimeter vehicle was there. Younger than she'd expected, compact, face that held nothing readable. He gave Dante a look, and Dante gave him one back, and they moved. The path along the tree line was not a path so much as a consistent absence of undergrowth, a corridor through which you could move if you knew it was there. She stayed close behind Dante, close enough that she could hear his breathing, steady, controlled, the breathing of someone who had managed his body through worse than this, though she could also hear underneath it the slight elevation that meant this was not nothing, not calm, just discipline over adrenaline. They were perhaps 60 feet from the house when the front door came open. She heard it rather than saw it. The sound of the door, then voices, then the particular acoustic change of multiple people moving into an interior space. Dante stopped. The man ahead of them stopped. They stood in the tree corridor and didn't move, and she focused on keeping her breathing from becoming audible and pressed one hand flat against the bark of the nearest tree and felt the rough cold of it against her palm and let it anchor her to the physical present. Then someone came around the east side of the house. One man, moving fast, scanning, hand at his hip. He saw them at the same moment they saw him, and there was a half second where all 3 of them processed what was happening, and then Dante's man moved first, not toward the threat but sideways between her and the man coming around the building, and she had just enough time to register the coordination of it, the way Dante simultaneously pulled her back and further into the tree line, before the sound of voices from inside the house rose sharply. They'd found it empty. "Go," Dante said, quiet and absolute. She went. They moved through the trees with the particular controlled haste of people who understood that speed and noise were trade-offs and had selected noise reduction as the priority. Branches, wet leaves, ground that was soft and uneven underfoot. She stumbled once and caught herself on a trunk and kept moving. Her pulse was in her ears, in her throat, in her wrists, everywhere, the whole vascular map of her body suddenly audible to her. Behind them, she heard someone enter the tree line, not subtle. Crashing. The sound of someone who had traded noise reduction for speed, which meant they'd been spotted or the haste had been triggered by something else. And either way, it meant the equation had changed. Dante's hand caught her arm, and they stopped behind the trunk of something large enough to provide cover, and she pressed her back against it and looked at him, and his eyes were already past her, tracking backward through the trees. The crashing sound came closer and then stopped. Silence. The worst kind. The kind that meant the pursuer had also stopped moving, had also started listening. She counted her own heartbeats. Got to 9 before a voice came from somewhere behind them, direction unclear, calling back toward the house. The answering call came from a different angle. 2 people. At least. Dante looked at her. His mouth moved without sound. When I move, you move. She nodded. He moved. She moved. They came out of the tree line onto a gravel road she hadn't known was there. The perimeter vehicle pulled up and running, and they were in it before the trees behind them had fully resolved into the shape of the man who emerged from them 30 seconds later. Too late. Standing at the edge of the gravel road watching them go. The vehicle moved fast. No lights. She sat in the back seat and breathed and stared at her hands and found that they were not shaking, which surprised her more than shaking would have. Something had happened to her fear in the last 10 minutes. Not gone, but transformed, compressed into something denser and less volatile. Something that sat in her chest like ballast rather than panic. Dante was on the phone again. She caught pieces. Address, compromised, Caruso. Grant Mercer's name delivered flatly like an item being added to a list. He ended the call, looked at her. You all right? Ask me again in an hour. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, they were far from that, but an acknowledgement. The estate, he said to the driver. She turned to look at him. That's what you said in the house. Before the lights came. It's where this ends, he said. I'm not going to keep moving you in circles. Caruso wants a confrontation. He's going to have one on ground I choose. And Grant? Grant Mercer is going to come to my estate tonight, he said. He's going to come because Caruso will tell him where you are, and because Caruso will have convinced him that arriving with whatever version of leverage he thinks he has is the right move. He paused. I want them both there. She looked at him. That sounds like a trap. It's a resolution, he said. There's a difference. Tell me the difference. A trap is designed to harm. A resolution is designed to end. He looked at her steadily. I want this finished. Both of these men, both of these problems, handled in one place on one night. After that, you never have to think about either of them again. She held his gaze. The vehicle was on a highway now, moving fast, the morning light still gray outside the windows. And if it goes wrong, she said, then we deal with what goes wrong. Blunt. No cushion on it. I'm not going to promise you clean outcomes. I don't do that. I know, she said. And she did. That was the thing about him. She'd never once felt managed. Handled, yes, in the purely practical sense, things arranged and organized around her. But not managed in the way she'd been managed for 3 years, the constant soft manipulation of her own perception. Dante Valenti told her the uncomfortable version and let her make her own choices about it. After 3 years of Grant, that honesty felt almost radical. She looked out the window. Okay, she said. The estate appeared after an hour's drive, through gates that opened before the vehicle had fully stopped. She'd built a picture of it from context, the way he spoke of it, the infrastructure she'd seen organized around his name, and what she found matched neither the under nor the overshoot. It was significant without being aggressive about it, the kind of property that communicated resources without performing them, stone walls and iron detail, and the dense plantings of a place that had been there long enough for things to grow properly. Inside, it was being organized. She could see it the moment they came through the main door, a controlled mobilization, the household staff moving with directed purpose alongside men she hadn't seen before, men in the posture and economy of movement that belonged to people who solved problems with their bodies. Dante moved through it all with the ease of someone walking back into a system that had been waiting for him, speaking quietly to people who listened and moved immediately after. She stood in the entryway and felt the scale of it for the first time. Not the house, the man. The extent of what he'd assembled around himself, the loyalty of it, the functionality. It was not what she'd imagined when she thought about his world, which had been something darker and more chaotic in her imagination. This was orderly. This was a man who had built something, not just taken it. Clara appeared beside her. I'll get you set up, Clara said. I don't want to be set up, Evelyn said. I want to know what's happening. Clara looked at her with an expression that adjusted itself. Then come with me, she said. They went to a room off the main hall that had the quality of a working space. A long table, monitors along one wall showing exterior camera feeds, a whiteboard with names and position markers that Evelyn studied without fully understanding. Clara stood beside her and explained what she knew, which was that Dante's security team had tracked 3 of Caruso's vehicles to within 12 miles of the estate, that Caruso himself had been confirmed in the city since that morning, and that Grant Mercer's location had been confirmed as a hotel 4 miles east. "They're staging," Evelyn said. "Yes." "What does Dante think they want, specifically? Not the broad version." Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Caruso wants a public demonstration. He's been waiting for a reason to move against Valenti's territory, and he thinks he has one, that Dante overstepped by involving himself in something that touched Caruso's business relationships. Grant Mercer has been laundering Caruso's consulting contracts for 18 months. We think he's leveraged that relationship into asking Caruso to help him get you back." She heard it land in her chest like something falling from a height. All of it, the full geometry of it, the way the two problems folded into each other, the way Grant's obsession and Caruso's ambition had found a shared address. "He asked a crime operation to help him get his ex-fiancée back," she said. "He asked a business partner who happens to operate outside conventional law," Clara said carefully, "and Caruso agreed because it gave him cover for something he wanted to do anyway. Using me. Using the situation." She stood at the whiteboard and looked at her own name, which was not on it, but understood, looking at the positions and names that were exactly where she fit in the space between them. She was the point where the 2 lines intersected. She was the reason 2 separate problems had become one. Not because she was weak, not because she'd made wrong choices, but because one man's need to possess her and another man's need to destabilize. Dante had found each other in the dark and decided to share resources. She thought about the journal upstairs in her bag. She thought about something that had been forming in the back of her mind since the car, since the tree line, since the moment she'd stood with her back against a trunk and counted her own heartbeats. She left the room. She found Dante in the main hall, in conversation with 2 men whose names she didn't know. He looked up when she approached, and something in his expression acknowledged that she had the posture of a person with something to say. He excused himself. They stepped into the adjacent room. "Grant's been laundering for Caruso," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "For 18 months." "Yes. I was with Grant for 18 months of that. I handled his correspondence. I scheduled his meetings. I organized his financial documentation." She paused. "I have a journal. 3 years, dates, amounts, names. I didn't know what I was recording. I was recording it for different reasons, but I have documentation of meetings with Caruso's front companies. I have the names of contacts Grant described as consulting clients that match names on your whiteboard in the other room." Dante was very still. "Evelyn, I know what I have," she said. "I've known for about 40 minutes. I've been sitting with it since Clara explained the Caruso-Mercer connection, and I've been matching it against everything I recorded in that journal, and I know what it means." She looked at him. "It means I have evidence, real evidence, the kind that doesn't just end Grant's hold on me. It ends his business, his arrangement with Caruso, and depending on what's in there, potentially his freedom." He looked at her for a long moment. "Where's the journal?" "Upstairs. In my bag." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to use it, but I need to understand exactly what I'm using it for before I decide how." She watched something move through his expression, something complicated that resolved into what she could only describe as a kind of clear respect, the specific respect a person gives another person who has surprised them in the direction of strength. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything. The full version. Caruso's operation, what Grant's role is in it, what's coming tonight, and what you're planning to do about it. All of it." She set her jaw. "I'm not a pressure point. I'm not a thing to be protected in a room while you resolve your problems in the driveway. I have information that is relevant to what's about to happen, and I am going to be in the room where it happens." He was quiet for a beat. "You understand what being in that room means," he said. "I understand what it means better than you think," she said. "I've been in rooms with Grant Mercer for 3 years. I know how men who operate in the dark behave when they think no one with any leverage is watching." She paused. "Show me what you have on Caruso. I'll show you what I have on Grant, and then we'll figure out what tonight looks like." He didn't argue. He took her back to the room with the monitors and the whiteboard, and he laid it all out. Not the abbreviated version, not the managed version, but the complete and uncomfortable architecture of 18 months of Caruso's expansion and Grant's utility within it, and the specific pressure points each man held. She sat at the long table and listened and asked questions, and he answered them, and then she went upstairs and got the journal. She sat at the table with him and opened it. It took 2 hours. What they built together in those 2 hours was not a trap, and it was not a plan exactly. It was something more like a case, the kind that didn't need to be argued in a courtroom to be effective. The kind that, when placed in front of two men who had structured their entire power on the assumption of their own invisibility, functioned as something much simpler and more devastating than legal process. It functioned as the end of their leverage. The afternoon light moved across the estate grounds, and the security positions were set, and the cameras were running, and Clara had made sure she ate something, and Dante had changed into something darker and simpler. And around 9 in the evening, the first report came in from the perimeter. Vehicles on the access road, 4 of them. She was standing in the room with the monitors when the report came, watching the camera feeds, and she watched the 4 sets of headlights come up the road with the same organized unhurry as the ones at the house that morning, and she felt her pulse lift, but it did not become panic. She breathed through it, in and out. The particular breathing of a woman who had made her decision several hours ago and was standing inside it now. Dante came to stand beside her. "You can still go upstairs," he said, not recommending it, just acknowledging the option. "No," she said. He nodded. Outside, the vehicles stopped. She watched the monitors, watched the doors open, watched the figures emerge. Caruso's men, 4, 6, 8 of them, taking positions with the organized competence of professionals. And then, one vehicle behind, a figure she recognized even on a grainy outdoor camera feed in the dark. Grant Mercer, in a coat she'd bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. She looked at him on the screen for a moment. At the coat. At the way he stood. That particular posture she knew so well. The deliberate broadcast of confidence. The weight-forward stance of a man who had never once walked into a room without first calculating how much of it he could own. She thought about the restaurant, about the ring on the tablecloth, about fine and sorry and yes. She looked away from the screen. She picked up the journal. She looked at Dante. "Ready," she said. He opened the cold air came in hard, and with it the sound of the night. Engines ticking down, gravel underfoot, the distant tree line and the dark sky beyond the estate lights. And then, carrying across all of it with a clarity that the open space amplified, came Caruso's voice, and behind it, closer and more familiar, and as awful as she'd known it would be, Grant's. She stepped through the door and into the light, and Grant Mercer looked across the distance between them and saw what she was holding, and something crossed his face. Recognition, calculation, and underneath both of those, working its way up through the architecture of a man who had built his entire world on the certainty that she would never. The light from the estate caught the journal's cover and turned it amber. Grant saw it from 40 feet away. And she watched his face do the things she'd spent 3 years learning to read. The rapid interior recalculation, the shifting of variables, the particular tightening around his eyes that meant he was reassessing what he'd walked into. He'd come here with leverage. That was the word she'd heard Caruso use on the perimeter cameras, the audio crackling through the monitors before she'd come outside. We arrive with leverage and we leave with terms. Grant had believed that. She could see it in the way he'd stepped out of the vehicle. That weight-forward confidence, the coat, the practiced composure of a man who had never once entered a room he hadn't already won in his own mind. He had not expected the journal. He had not expected her to be standing at the front door holding it. Caruso was the one who spoke first. He was shorter than she'd imagined from context, compact and gray-haired, the specific solidity of a man who had survived through decision rather than size. He stood in the forecourt with 4 of his people fanned behind him and looked at Dante with the expression of a man who had prepared something and intended to deliver it. "Valenti," he said, the word carrying flat across the gravel. "We can do this reasonably." "I've been reasonable for 3 months," Dante said. I was standing 2 steps ahead of Evelyn, not blocking her, not performing protection, just positioned, the way he positioned himself in every space, with the slight forward weight of someone who had absorbed the habit of being first. "That's finished." Caruso's eyes moved to Evelyn, to the journal. He was too experienced to show what he thought about it, but she'd spent 3 years watching a man manage his expressions, and she knew the microgeography of controlled reaction. Caruso's jaw had tightened by a fraction. "The woman isn't part of this," Caruso said. "She's standing here," Dante said. "That makes her part of it." Grant had not moved from his position, 10 feet to Caruso's left. He was looking at Evelyn with an intensity that had no performance left in it. Stripped of the social coding, it was just the raw current of it, the obsessive fixation she'd lived inside for 3 years and had never been able to name cleanly until she was outside of it. He looked at her like she was a thing that belonged somewhere specific and had been placed incorrectly. Evelyn. His voice was steady. He'd worked on that steadiness. She could hear the labor underneath it. Whatever they've told you, nobody told me anything, she said. I read it myself. 18 months of your meeting notes. The names of Caruso's front companies. The accounts you structured for them. The consulting fees that were not consulting fees. She paused. I typed some of those documents, Grant. I scheduled some of those meetings. I didn't know what I was looking at then. I know now. Something moved through the forecourt. Not sound. More like a change in pressure. The atmospheric shift of a situation that has just revealed its actual shape. Caruso turned to look at Grant. Grant was still looking at her. You were in my files, he said. They were my files too, she said. I lived in that apartment. I ran that office when your assistant was out. I was there. Her voice was even. She had worked for this evenness all afternoon, had rehearsed it in the way you rehearsed something, not to make it false, but to make sure fear didn't swallow it. You made me invisible and then you forgot I could see. Grant's composure cracked. Not dramatically. It was a hairline fracture, the kind you only recognized if you knew the material. A slight widening of the eyes. A breath that came out slightly wrong. The tell of a man who has had the floor shift under him and has not yet figured out how to redistribute his weight. What do you want? He said. Quiet. Private register. The voice he used when they were alone and he was trying to recalibrate her. She felt it. The old pull of that voice. The way it had worked on her for years. The specific frequency of it. Felt it and named it and let it pass through her without finding anything to attach to. I want you to be finished, she said. I want to walk away from this and have you become someone who used to be in my life. Nothing more than that. Evelyn, I have copies, she said. Not the journal. Copies of the documents. Stored in 3 places you don't know about with instructions that don't require me to do anything for them to be used. That's not a threat. She looked at him steadily. That's information. So you understand that whatever you've been building since Friday night, the missing persons narrative, the photographs, whatever Caruso promised you he could deliver, none of it changes what exists and where it is. The silence in the forecourt was absolute. Grant's lawyer voice, his management voice, his very clear conversation voice, all of it was absent. What was left was something she'd rarely seen from him, the actual man underneath the architecture, smaller and more frightened than the structure he'd built around himself, standing in a forecourt at night realizing that the woman he'd spent 3 years making small had spent 3 years taking notes. Caruso had turned fully away from Dante. He was looking at Grant with an expression that had moved beyond controlled neutrality into something harder and less patient. You said she had nothing, Caruso said. Grant didn't answer immediately. You said, Caruso said again, the words coming out with a flatness that carried more threat than volume, that she was not a liability. She's not, Grant started. She's standing in front of me with 18 months of documentation. Caruso's voice didn't rise. That was the thing that made it land harder, the absolute flatness of it. In what specific way is that not a liability? Grant looked at Caruso, then at Dante, then at Evelyn. She watched him do it, watched him run the calculation one final time, the same calculation he'd been running since Friday night, the same one he'd been running for 3 years in their relationship, the constant arithmetic of control and leverage, and what he could make people do through pressure applied at the right points. She watched him arrive, for the first time in her experience of him, at an answer that had no workable variable. He had nothing, not because Dante had taken it from him, not because Caruso had failed to deliver, because she was standing here, 31 years old, with 3 years of his own documentation in her hands. And the look on her face was not the look of a woman who could be managed back into compliance. She watched him understand that. It took about 4 seconds, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever seen from him. Felix, Dante said. Caruso turned. We're going to talk, Dante said. Not here, not tonight, but we're going to sit down, and we're going to draw lines that we both live inside going forward, and we're going to do that because the alternative costs both of us more than the conversation does. He paused. That's still available to you. As of tonight, that's still available. Caruso looked at him for a long moment. She could see the calculation happening, older and slower than Grant's, more seasoned, the calculation of a man who had been in enough situations to know which ones had exits and which ones were rooms. This one had an exit. She watched him decide to use it. "Send me a time," Caruso said. Dante nodded. Caruso looked at his people and something shifted in the group's posture. The release of held tension, the reconfiguration of 8 people who had come ready for something specific and were now being redirected. They moved back toward the vehicles with the organized efficiency of a reversal that had been practiced. Caruso stopped before getting into his vehicle. He looked back at Grant. "Whatever you need from me," Caruso said, "is finished. Consider our arrangement concluded." He got in the vehicle. The doors closed. The 3 vehicles moved back down the access road, and their lights diminished through the tree line, and then they were gone. Grant stood alone in the forecourt. Dante's people were still positioned. She could feel them in the periphery, the quiet presence of the perimeter. But no one moved. No one needed to. Grant looked at her. The coat was too heavy for the night. She'd noticed that when he first got out of the vehicle, it was the wrong weight for the temperature. He'd miscalculated or dressed in a hurry. And that small wrongness made him look, standing there, without Caruso's people around him, without his attorney, without the architecture of the life he'd built. It made him look ordinary in a way she hadn't seen before. Just a man in a coat that was too heavy, standing on gravel in the dark, out of moves. "You're going to give that to someone," he said. "The journal." "I have a meeting with an attorney on Tuesday," she said. "Whatever comes from that is up to the evidence, not up to me. You'll destroy me." "You made choices," she said. "For 18 months, with Caruso's money and with me in that apartment, you made choices. I didn't make them for you." He took a step toward her. Not threatening. Something almost worse, the desperate forward movement of a man trying to close a distance that had become unbridgeable. 3 years, Evelyn. 3 years of... "I know what 3 years was," she said. "I was there." He stopped. Dante had not moved, had not inserted himself. She was aware of his presence to her right with the peripheral awareness she'd developed over the past 2 days. Steady, present, not intervening. "I don't understand," Grant said. And the awful thing about it was that she believed him. Not the self-pity of it, but the core of it. The genuine incomprehension of a man who had never once developed the vocabulary for what he'd done because he'd never needed to. The systems around him, the compliance of people he pressured, the silence of women who withdrew complaints, the professional world that asked no questions, had never required him to understand. "I gave you everything. You gave me nothing that was mine," she said quietly. "Everything you gave me had your name on it. Everything I had was on your terms. That's not giving. That's keeping." She looked at him. "I don't hate you. I want you to know that. Hating you would require me to keep thinking about you." She paused. "I'm done thinking about you." Grant Mercer stood in the forecourt of an estate that wasn't his, at the far end of the worst week of his life, and she watched the last of the scaffolding come down. Not with violence, not with drama, just the slow structural failure of a man whose entire architecture had depended on the compliance of someone who had stopped complying. He turned around. He walked back to his vehicle. He got in. The vehicle moved down the access road, slower than Caruso's, with the diminished momentum of a thing that had lost its purpose. The taillights bled red through the tree line and then were gone. The forecourt was empty. She stood in the cold air and breathed. Dante came to stand beside her, not speaking. Just there, in the way he'd been there since Friday night, present without filling the space with himself, occupying the area adjacent to her without requiring her to do anything with his presence. She looked at the access road where the lights had been. She thought she might cry and found that she didn't. What came instead was something quieter and less dramatic. An internal settling, like sediment in disturbed water finding the bottom. The slow return of something she'd forgotten the feel of. "It's not finished," she said. "The attorney, the documentation. That's going to be a long process." "Yes," Dante said. "He might fight it. He has resources." "He does," Dante said. "But so do you." She looked at him. "I'm not going to rely on yours," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm talking about yours." She thought about that. About the journal in her hands, her record, her documentation, 3 years of her own life written in her own hand, kept for her own reasons in a hiding place she'd built for herself. The resource that hadn't come from him or from anyone. The resource she'd built in the dark, alone, without knowing what it was for. She looked at the estate around her, the stone, the iron detail, the dense plantings, the cameras at the gate, the cars in the drive, the infrastructure of a man who had built his world around the ability to handle what came at it. I need to go somewhere else, she said. Dante was quiet for a moment. Tonight? Not tonight, but soon. She looked at him. This is your world. I need to be somewhere that's mine. He held her gaze, and there was something in his expression. She'd been watching his expressions for 2 days now, learning the geography of them. That was complicated and genuine and had nothing managing in it. What is yours? He asked. She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, she said. But I know it doesn't start by staying inside someone else's walls. He nodded slowly. I have a contact, he said. An attorney who specializes in protective orders and civil documentation. She's independent. No connection to my business. She's good. He paused. I'll give you her name. What you do with it is yours. Okay, she said. And there's a building downtown, he said. I have a unit on the 8th floor. It's held in a separate LLC. No connection to the Valenti name on any public record. Small, clean, no one knows about it. He paused. I'm not offering you a place to stay indefinitely. I'm offering you 60 days, while you find something that's yours. She looked at him. Just 60 days, she said. Just 60 days, he said. And then whatever you build from there, you build it yourself. She thought about Dana Carver, who had left the city. She thought about what it might have meant for Dana to have had 60 days and an attorney's number and documentation stored in 3 places. All right, she said. She looked at the journal one more time, at the cover, at the slight wear of it from 3 years inside a hiding place under a floor. Then she put it in her bag. She went inside. The months that followed were not clean. She had been prepared for that, or had tried to be, and even her preparation had underestimated it somewhat. The legal process was exactly what she'd expected it to be. Slow and expensive and requiring her to tell the same story in different registers to different people who each held a portion of what happened next. She found the attorney Dante had named, and the attorney was exactly as advertised. Precise, unsentimentally competent, and expensive in the way of someone who earned what she charged. They filed civil documentation the first week. They contacted the Wilton Street precinct about Dana Carver the second week. Dana, they found, had moved 2 states east, and when contacted through an intermediary, agreed to speak to an investigator. She had not been the only one. There were, it emerged, 3 others. Women who had withdrawn complaints, moved, or simply absorbed what had happened to them into the sediment of their daily lives, the way people absorbed things they couldn't change. The documentation in the journal gave all of them context, a connective tissue, a record that had existed without knowing it was a record. Grant hired 2 attorneys. The first week he was aggressive, counterfilings, procedural motions, the expensive machinery of a man using a legal system as a weapon the way he used everything else. She had expected this too, and had prepared for it to be exhausting, and it was. There were days she called Nora from the 8th floor unit downtown and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets and talked for an hour about nothing consequential, just the specific medicine of her sister's voice. Nora had asked once, carefully, about Dante. Complicated, Evelyn had said. Good complicated or bad complicated? Honest complicated, she'd said, which I'm still deciding what to do with. What she did with it, in those 60 days and beyond, was this. She let it be what it was without deciding too fast what category it belonged in. She saw him 4 times in the first 2 months. Twice for practical reasons. Information that needed to exchange hands. Documentation that required discussion. Once for dinner that had started as practical and had not remained practical, the conversation lasting 4 hours in a quiet restaurant where no one knew either of them, and she'd laughed twice at things he said. And both times it had surprised her, the sound of her own laugh, the involuntary quality of it. The 4th time he had come to the 8th floor unit with a bottle of wine and no agenda, and she had let him in, and they had sat at the small kitchen table, and she had told him things she hadn't told anyone else. Not the facts of it. She'd told those to attorneys and investigators, and eventually to Nora in a full and direct accounting, but the interior version, the texture of 3 years, the specific ways a person's sense of their own reality could be worked on until it became unreliable. She told him about the year she'd stopped reading because she hadn't had the concentration. She told him about the apologizing, not just to Grant but to everyone, the way it had become default, The way she'd started leading every sentence with sorry, as if preemptively acknowledging her own wrongness, was the safest way to move through space. He had listened without interrupting. When she finished, he'd said, "That's not who you are now." "I know," she'd said, "but it was who I was. And I'm not going to pretend it wasn't, because pretending means I can't see it coming if something ever tries to do it again." He had looked at her for a long moment. "That's the smartest thing I've heard anyone say," he said, "about surviving something." Grant's legal effort had collapsed by the fourth month. The civil case built with the documentation from the journal and the testimonies of 4 women was not something 2 attorneys could paper over. And the financial investigation that had been opened, separately, by an agency that had been looking at Caruso's consulting arrangements, had folded Grant's operation into its scope without any help from her. The evidence she'd preserved had been useful to that investigation, but it had not been the engine of it. Grant had built a thing that was going to collapse without her involvement. She had simply been the person who had kept records of it. He accepted a settlement agreement in the 5th month. The terms required him to withdraw from the city's professional networks and submit to a supervised compliance period. He didn't fight it. She had expected him to fight, had braced for another cycle of machinery, and instead he had simply stopped. She found out later from the attorney that his 2 partners had dissolved the consultancy the week before the settlement, that the professional infrastructure he'd spent 15 years building had made a collective judgment about the cost of association with his name. She had not felt triumph when she heard this. She had felt something more like the completion of a long exhale, the end of a breath she'd been holding since before she knew she was holding it. She stood at the window of the 8th floor unit the morning after the settlement was signed and looked at the city below and drank coffee in the early light, and thought about what it felt like to have forward available to her. Not the performance of moving forward, not the language of surviving and thriving that she'd absorbed from years of people telling her how resilience was supposed to work. Just the actual physical experience of a morning with no threat in it. No calculus of what to say and how to say it. No anticipatory flinch in the body. Just a window. Just light. Just coffee. She had 60 days in the unit and she had used 90 because Dante had not pushed her out, and she had needed the extra time and she had asked for it and he had said yes without the kind of qualification she'd have expected from someone who trafficked in conditions. When she finally found the apartment she wanted, a place 3 miles east, a lease in her name, a set of keys she'd had cut herself, she had packed the 8th floor in half a day. She had called him before she left. "I'm moving out today," she said. "I know," he said. "Clara mentioned." "Does Clara mention everything?" "Most things." She had laughed, and it had been easy, which still surprised her sometimes, the ease of it, the absence of labor in it. "I want to say something," she said. "Okay. What you did in that restaurant," she said. "Walking over to the table. I've thought about it 100 times and I still can't fully account for it. Most people would have looked away. Every person at every other table looked away. I had information," he said. "It made it easier to—" "Don't do that," she said. "You had information about Grant's business. You didn't have information about what it was like to sit across that table from him. You saw that. You chose to see it when you didn't have to." She paused. "I just wanted you to know that I know the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "You did the hard part," he said. "The ring, the word no. That was yours." "It was," she said. "I know that too." She was smiling. She could feel it on her face, the particular quality of it. Not the performed smile she'd trained herself to produce for 3 years, but the real architecture of it, the involuntary kind, the kind that didn't ask permission. She picked up the last box. She walked out of the 8th floor unit. She locked the door and slid the key under it and went downstairs and put the box in her car and drove east through the city with the windows down in the late October cold, the air sharp and real against her face, the city moving around her with its ordinary and different life. 6 months later, she sat in the office of the Hartwell Foundation, named for herself, which had felt audacious when the attorney suggested it, and felt now like the most natural thing in the world, and looked across a table at a woman who had come in that morning the way Evelyn had once sat in a restaurant, braced, shoulders that wanted to curve inward, hands that needed something to do. The foundation had been Evelyn's idea. The funding had been a combination of her own resources, a grant she'd written herself over 3 weeks of learning how to write grants, and she was honest about this in the foundation's public materials, because she'd decided that honesty was the practice and not the exception. a significant initial contribution from a private donor who wished to remain unnamed. She had not asked him to contribute. He had arranged it through a separate legal entity and informed her after, and she had called him and said, "You should have asked first." And he had said, "You would have said no." And she had said, "Yes, I would have, but that's my decision to make." And he had said, "You're right, I'm sorry." She had stood in her new kitchen, her lease, her keys, and held the phone and understood that an apology from Dante Valenti had the specific weight of something that didn't come often and was genuine when it did. She had told him to come to dinner on Friday, and he had come, and they had cooked something impractical and slightly burned and eaten it at the kitchen table she'd bought at a second-hand place on the east side, and it had been the most ordinary evening she could remember having in years. Ordinary in the best possible sense. The sense that means nothing is wrong. Nothing is being managed. Nothing is waiting to detonate. Across the table from her now, the woman with the curved shoulders looked at the legal forms in her hands with the expression of someone confronting something both necessary and terrifying. Evelyn recognized the expression with the intimacy of someone who had worn it on her own face. She leaned forward. "Take your time," she said. "There's no version of this where you have to do anything today. Today is just information." The woman looked up. "Does it get—" She stopped. Tried again. "Does it actually get better? Or is that something people say?" Evelyn thought about the restaurant, about the ring on the tablecloth, about Dana Carver, who had been located and heard, and whose name was now part of a public record that said, "This happened. It was real. It was witnessed." About the morning with the coffee and the window and the light. About the specific quality of a morning with no threat in it. "It gets real," she said. "That's not the same as better, but it's more than better. When you get to the other side of it, what you have is yours in a way that nothing was yours inside it. The hard parts are yours. The good parts are yours." She paused. "Nobody can take credit for you surviving it. Not the people who helped, not the process. You." She looked at the woman directly. "That part is only ever yours." The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she uncurved her shoulders. A small thing, a structural thing. The quiet foundational shift of a person who has just been reminded that they have a spine and have decided to use it. Evelyn recognized that too. She straightened the forms on the table between them and let the morning light come in through the office window. East facing, the same as the room at the house and the trees. The same direction she'd woken up to on the morning after everything changed, and felt, without performing it, without needing to name it or contain it, the specific weight of a life that had decided to be lived. Not saved, not rescued, lived. By her. Entirely and finally and without apology. By her.